plus like samurais instead of knights and armor. So that's one subject that doesn't matter.
I don't know how to contribute to this because I feel like, my video game career ended in 2011 when my brother took his Xbox to college. And that was it for me.
I have a good rhythm sometimes of keeping games around in the room so that I can quit music without having to leave the house. Like, I need to still be around the work studio, but I need to be able to switch off my brain because it overheats really quickly when I'm trying to like deal with a lot of music making factors. So it's handy to have a game around in that context to like aggressively like shut the brain off for a moment, and then it's like recharged 15 minutes later and is ready to go at it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's something that's like like mentally active but is not high stakes.
You keep the brain engine on idle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it like lures your brain into this like playing mode of cognition.
Yeah.
Yeah. I listened to a podcast that Ade recommended to me from Andrew Huberman, which was about the brain state that your brain gets into when you're in some sort of play activity.
Yeah.
And one of the critical ingredients of that state is that the activity has to be like low stakes, because if you feel like there's like a big threat if you fail, then your brain won't relax really, and you won't be able to get that divergent thinking and stuff like that. So yeah, I think there's really something to be said for fucking around and to idle your engine like that.
And I last night I also was dealing with a song or an arrangement that I've been hitting my head against the wall against for this whole 7-week cycle.
Yeah.
I've been back and forth with this thing, and last night I finally called it. I called it a bad job and set it down. And that's another like it's a little more relevant of a prompt, but still like very off in my own private
what do you mean
world.
by that? I'm actually kind of interested in that. Like, what do you mean? So you set down some element of the song you're currently working on.
I gave up the entire song.
The entire song.
Yeah, I'm just gonna...
The idea for the song or the current. Well, like, what do you mean when you say you gave up the song? What do you mean, like the whole everything you'd built up?
Yes.
So you're just like gonna start from a completely blank slate on this next song. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting. I guess that's a little bit of a different design iteration process, because for me, when I run up against a roadblock, I start backtracking and undoing the things that resulted in me getting myself, painting myself into a corner until I reach the fork in the road. That was where it all went wrong, and then I take a different fork. But it sounds like what you're saying is that the song has a kind of like soul to it that can't be disentangled. You can't deconstruct it. You just have to just like toss it.
Yeah, it has a very strong identity, and that's why I was pushing through resistance for 6 weeks straight. Partly because I didn't have enough time to sit and like critically think earlier and waste less time. but partly because it was a really distinct piece that was like really well built. So if there was something wrong with clicking with it, that's my fault, not the song's fault. So I was pushing through. But it was like Sekiro. It's just like, no, this is way too fucking hard. Songwriting doesn't need to be this hard.
Yeah, do you think there's maybe a risk of falling in love with how hard things are, or becoming using the idea that you're using the feeling of resistance as almost like a comforting familiarity over time?
Yeah, it's a balance.
Yeah.
It's a balance you gotta walk, because if you aren't pushing the most weight you can, then that's wasted time.
Mostly heat.
But then on the other side, if you aren't enjoying yourself,
right,
then what are you doing?
Yeah, I go back and forth on that too, because I'd come up with this very useful idea that when I encounter a feeling of resistance, I try to look at it as like a sign that I'm on the right track. In order to motivate myself to not feel bad about encountering difficulty. It's more like, okay, I actually struck the surface of the problem I'm working on. But that's kind of dangerous because, you can start to almost I guess it's an example of confusing the metric for the objective, confusing how you're measuring what you're trying to do for what it is you're trying to do, which is a pretty common thing that's talked about on the kind of forums on the internet, like startup circle jerk type forums, where people come up with big schemes of how to measure their productivity, and then invariably what ends up happening is they start aiming for, this happens in companies, startup companies all the time, where you have some very motivated, very visionary person who's responsible for getting other people to do something in service of that vision, but those people don't have that vision, and so they end up accomplishing only, they end up aiming for the ways that the person in charge has chosen to measure success. Yeah. And I feel like you can almost do that to yourself, that if you use that kind of device where you go okay, hard work is good. I mean, yeah, it is, as long as the reason you're working hard is because you're working on something. But if you're seeking out hard work, you've lost the plot. You've completely lost the plot. If you think that trying to find something hard is the way, really, you should be trying to find an easy way, and then when it gets hard anyways, you did the right thing. It's kind of weird, paradoxical thing, but maybe the key is just not to think about it too much.
So what about Tom Robbins?
What about Tom Robbins? Do you know who that is? Are you familiar with Tom Robbins?
He's a novelist.
Yeah.
I tried to start reading Jitterbug Perfume once and got maybe a chapter in. And I'm familiar with the foreword he wrote for Terrence's Archaic Revival.
Yeah.
What else? He's got a very whimsical tone. Whimsical, radical.
Yeah.
Often outside of morals for the sake of telling interesting anecdotes.
Yeah. Yeah. He was, Alicia's reading Jitterbug Perfume, And I just like cracked it open. I was reading and I was like, wow, this dude is, who else do I know that talks like this and writes like this? And I was like, oh yeah, it's very sort of, and then so I was like looking at Wikipedia, and apparently, I guess him and Terrence McKenna were personal friends. I'm like, that makes sense. It's so cool that, I don't know, it makes me wonder, like, is there, like, so, you know, when you look back on what was going on in like the 80s, you know, late 70s, 80s, 90s, it seems like the people who we're still talking about knew each other to an extent that is incredible considering how big the world is. So I don't know, do you think that's just because like we're like there was something different about the world they were living in or what they were doing, or is it just we have like hindsight bias to where we only know about the people who were in this certain circle of surviving, you know, like a certain strain of a certain community that had like an outsized impact, and that's why we're still talking about this group? Or like, is there a modern equivalent of that? Is there an underground right now of people who authors that all kind of know each other that people are gonna talk about in 40 years?
Yeah, well, I have some thoughts about this, but they're pretty subterranean, but they're deep thoughts because they inform the way I'm building my career now.
Yeah.
With a phenomena like that in our past, I am actively trying to mythologize Chico and keep the highest productive players in my life close to each other, because we're not gonna ever know that we're in a golden age enlightenment phase. We're just going to create a future where people are going to look at the works of Stuart, the works of Jade, the works of someone else, the works of Alex Light, and then like trace back their bios and at some point notice that they all lived in Chico for this period of time.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. We're not going to know it.
And
Anyone who's in a golden age of whatever can't know it. If they know it, that you've already failed, because you become too self-conscious of it.
And I am really fascinated when I find those connections and cultural figures that I look up to. It's it makes it seem like things are really connected. It's made me feel like when I've discovered relationships between disparate characters in my imagination, real people, but dead now,
right?
And I realize they knew each other, it makes me feel like everything's connected. Most recently was a much more mundane example of watching interviews of the rock band that I like, Incubus, and they got on the same record label as the band that started a genre called nu metal, which is Korn, and their label mates together, and their label mates Incubus is with a bunch of bands that made 90s music, made heavy 90s music, and that was all a locality thing. They were all in and around LA, and that's where the record industry is. So lo and behold, that's where the biggest like hits of modern music came from. But then a week before that, I found a 2-hour interview with a famous producer of that ilk named Ross Robinson. And that was a more profound moment of like strange connections, because he's responsible for making the most influential nu metal albums, and nu metal is responsible for pushing heavy music forward. I don't know how to explain it in layman's terms, metal became mainstream. It was called nu metal.
I've heard of nu metal. My introduction to nu metal was in Finland.
And it's characterized by really raw performances by the singer when it's good, and very like exposing negative autobiographical lyrical content, and singing that's like really untrained for the sake of being raw, but just like has enough melodic chops to pull a good hook together. And I guess it's really experimental and groove based, and metal up to that point was much more classical.
Anthemic, kind of like.
There was the hair metal, like ballads and anthems.
Yeah.
And there was the straight, like, shred metal that was much more about technicality and the classics, classical music.
Right.
And no groove, just like...
Right.
Just straight across the sheet music. So nu metal was much more about groove and experimentation, and what could you make your guitar do with all these new guitar effects pedals that existed now. But Ross Robinson is the interview definitely revealed him, and I kind of already knew this, as the spiritual core of the entire movement. Like the entire genre explosion had a manifesto. It had a philosophy.
Wow.
And the seat of that conscious philosophy of the expression
was
Ross Robinson. And he's this strange mix of really, really, really passionate and really, really untrained and really, really hippie. Like really all about love and being in service to the person in front of you and mindfulness practices and stuff. And he's made the darkest albums that have probably ever been made. And he changed my life. He's literally one of the people that raised me.
Wow.
Because of how deeply those albums he's made have been installed into my consciousness.
Yeah, you're living in the world that he made in some sense.
In a very real sense, I'm living in the world Ross Robinson made.
In a very real sense, because if he hadn't have done that, the activities of your life would be would play out differently.
Yes, and I was able to like re-listen to some of the material he was in the studio, being the producer for those specific records, and I realized like, the originality and the stunning individuality and the like exposing the rawest core of the performances that they could get to.
Yeah.
Those were Ross Robinson moves.
Yeah.
Those weren't these musicians. Those were Ross Robinson manipulating these musicians, like him pushing these young, untrained people to, partly to get Ross to get through his own emotional stuff. He would manipulate these musicians into exposing really vulnerable parts of themselves.
What a crazy thing. It's like a high energy version of like hippie sensitivity. I feel like that's almost one of the weakest points of hippie shit, for lack of a better term, is it's really low energy sometimes. And this, like more general than music or whatever, but yeah, like I think that.
But an example being reggae music.
It's one example. Although I don't think that's almost like, I guess that's sort of tangential to the whole thing. I guess I just mean like meditation, like can meditation, like if you take meditation to be some kind of like, just in general, like if you take meditation to be a byword for self-awareness, which I guess I do, considering how sort of like mushy that term has become in the modern parlance, I think that there's a bias towards seeing meditation as a really still, low energy activity where you're almost falling asleep. But, properly viewed, any activity that rends open your inner world could be considered meditation. And some of them might be a lot more dynamic than sitting still and focusing on your breath. I think when you really get into, maybe like the focusing on your breath thing is like a place to start, but ideally you should try to learn to move through the world in a way that you can be really dynamic and at the same time completely aware of what you're doing. Unless your goal is to just like, get off the wheel of Dharma or something, which it isn't my personal goal. I know some people are trying to do that, but I think that's what's the funny thing about meditation is it's kind of become sort of, there's been a little sleight of hand where the original idea has been kind of turned into this productivity tool type thing, which I'm perfectly fine with, but I just want to come clean about the idea that it's a tool to use to engage more fully with the world. Because it's really funny how meditation, which is something which is like in its original context really about, as far as I understand it, the whole point is to literally leave this cycle of rebirth. It's this very strict idea of getting off of the wheel of Dharma. But I don't think many people care about that at all, and I certainly don't. I don't want to get off the wheel of Dharma. I really don't want to. I want to be more fully engaged in the wheel of Dharma. So I have like literally the exact opposite goal of what Buddhism is purportedly understood to, to be all about. And I could be I could be totally off in the weeds, not understanding the context of what I'm talking about. But I think that something like metal, there may be like these powerful artistic expressions of the soul are like the cracks that, our like Western civilization's need for self-awareness get forced through because of like the extremely high energy society that we're in.
Yeah.
And in some sense, they're a lot more valuable. I guess I would rather go to a fucking metal concert and just be surrounded and getting like hit in the face with like some sweaty long-haired dudes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that is more transcendentally, it feels more authentic in some way because that is a unique expression of our actual culture instead of like an imported product.
Yeah, it seems actually relevant to the times we're in.
Yeah.
And metal has been important and necessary to me because of the times we're in. It seems dishonest or irrelevant or just ineffectual to deal with music that's purely for calming. So there's a sense that art is alchemistic, but then if it's not dealing with the core issues of the day, emotionally at least, then that alchemistic power can't be brought to bear on anything. So music that's like purely focused on good times.
Well, at best it's entertaining, and at worst it's anesthetizing.
And a genre like metal can have a big enough dynamic range to fit the way it feels to exist, which I think existence has a huge dynamic range of intensity and high points and low points. So if your music doesn't have that too, your music isn't getting, it isn't making its abstraction from this actual experience. And there's an attitude that I share with Ross Robinson, that there's something about damage and evil effects and harm and trauma. There's something about acceptance and engaging your real emotional reactions to that trauma, and just being as you are and allowing the bad thing to keep moving through the karmic wheel. Instead of trying to change it, getting curious and engaging with it, rolling forward with that pain transmutes the pain into something beautiful and novel that couldn't have existed if that bad thing had never happened.
That's such a radical idea to actually put that into practice.
And so so that's the philosophy of this one guy.
Right.
And so it's, in terms of Tom Robbins and seeing connected relationships of people you thought were disparate, like all these different bands that have vastly different sounds and vastly different messages, and all like have been listened to me at different points in my life. There's one guy.
Yeah.
Like, those aren't disparate things. That's like one guy made all those different pieces of art happen, and that's pretty mind-blowing. And the guy himself is a lot like me.
Is he still alive?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't know where he'll go from here. I don't see his albums lately as being very influential or good. I think he's having trouble catching up with the world we're in today.
Yeah.
But he has a very good articulation of how he made the world of back then.
You know, you can't begrudge anyone for falling behind, because it's enough to do something great and then let that be, I think. It's about the integrity of what you make, not the ability to continually update yourself. I think you can be dated and still be really respected.
But it'd be even better if you just kept getting better.
Yeah, but there might be something subtle that's lost in holding that continual change as an ideal, because that's a really good ideal when you're trying to do something. But if you're over the hill, maybe not changing is almost kind of makes you into sort of a representative of a time and a space, a time and a place and a perspective, that almost like you're the physical embodiment of the era that you characterized, which is kind of cool that there's like an artifact in the form of a human who still has that, still living in the 90s or something.
But that's not what trees do, so it's not satisfying for me.
Yeah, but in a larger...
I can't like abide by what I see as, and very little perspective on if this is accurate to the people that sit back on their laurels, but I can't abide by sitting back on my laurels. I want to grow until I fucking drop, and I think it'd be doing a disservice to the intensity of the historical window we're in to not leverage that fact of always growing and discovering in as singular and linear a direction as you can manage without going insane, so that you can just fucking force this fissure into human history.
Yeah.
Like 90 fucking years in one direction. It's people's inability to do that, or unwillingness to do that. That's the reason why we only have one Lord of the Rings. Like, no one's matched that yet. No one's iterated upon that yet. And that's because he put his entire lifetime into it. He was working on the Silmarillion until he fucking died.
Yeah. Yeah, Albert Einstein was trying to figure out shit on his deathbed.
Exactly.
He was fucking scribbling equations, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe, I guess... I still think there's something about... Like, it's one of those things, I think if you aimed for resting on your laurels, that's a bad thing. But if it happens to you anyways, I think there is some grace in accepting it.
Of course, you have to accept it, otherwise you're like an old guy who is pretending he's young.
Yeah,
and
there's kind of grotesque.
And that's gross.
It's kind of gross, yeah.
And what you end up doing in that is you become a vampire, which we see in our political situation.
That's a perfect example,
It is pure vampirism.
Vampiric, it is.
So yes, there is an acceptance of passing out of reality and just taking care of your affairs.
Yeah.
So that you can age with grace.
Yeah. I just want to say I'm right there with you on the whole forcing a fissure into human history thing. That kind of intensity is really the only fitting attitude when you realize that you're plummeting through infinite, great leap status. Everything's falling with you. Fucking, you're gonna die. I don't really know what other attitude is really appropriate to life than trying to make what you can desperately, rapidly be fixated on changing the universe as soon as you're able to accept that being in the universe is something good and proper and part of a larger narrative. As soon as you come to terms and own up to that, you better get to work. But I guess I don't know. I can feel myself when I hypothetically imagine myself as an old man. I think that I'll have to I hope I can escape into a different dimension of feeling like I'm changing things, because I really doubt that when I'm 80 years old, my mind is going to be quick enough to and capable enough, and my short-term memory is going to be functioning sharp enough to be able to create software that changes the world. Because it's irrelevant. Because if that's the direction you want to go at that point in your life, you will have resources under you fulfilled by young people who have that flexibility. Become more of an allocator, decider person, yeah.
Yes, and you just direct the affairs of an
army.
Maybe
that's what I'm talking to, is about this going into a different dimension and trying to follow the natural progression of, at the stage of life you're in, are you literally on the front lines holding the sword, or are you directing the battle kind of thing? Yeah.
Well,
but there's something noble about not giving up the sword too. I mean, look at Elon Musk. He fucking gets down there and fucks with things in the assembly line himself. That's pretty inspiring. Yeah.
And Tolkien, in my mind, is a good example of this, because he did shift dimensions to even write fantasy. He was
a linguist before.
He was a linguist before, and took part in the Great War before that.
Yeah.
And was commanded, maybe had 10 or 20 soldiers under him.
Yeah.
So he shifted dimensions of how he wanted to be active in the world just by shifting into fiction writing. And then the form of The Lord of the Rings as a novel illustrates, I think, a exuberant birth into reality, and then aging with grace, and putting your affairs in order, and riding the tiger like all the way to the finish line with the same amount of integrity that you started with.
Yeah.
Because the book does not end when the ring goes into the fire.
Yeah.
That's not when the book ends.
You've said this before. Yeah.
I have said this before.
Right.
This is why he's a master. He ties up the affairs of every single open character arc and makes it a complete fucking arc of achievement. And that's because I think that's because he had his eyes on the spiritual core of things, is do it once and do it right. And then you've changed the base code of all reality.
Interesting. Yeah, it's funny you use that code metaphor because that's actually very explicitly true in software, that if you make code modular, it's a lot, and it can be reused independently in different contexts. And if you have code that has that has a lot of external dependencies, then it's only going to be real in a very specific context, and it probably won't survive. It won't survive in the future. Like if you have like to use a biological metaphor, like if you had an organism that can only exist in a very, very hyper-specific environment, it's likely not going to contribute a whole lot to the future of the gene pool, so to speak.
So there's a tie-in to meditation here, where sunny side to meditation is putting a suspension of disbelief, or whatever the appropriate, like putting some distance and objectivity between you and the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree with you that it's dumb to accept a core tenet that life is suffering and then try and get out of it with all of your creative energy, and then all your creative energy is devoted to dulling your ability to deal with the real world.
Yeah.
That's not good. But art and code writing both are, if you're steeped in the world and have no recourse to meditation, or the principle of meditation, then you mistake the camouflage for the actual reality, and you go chasing things of the moment to try and be relevant right now. But having a mental ability to step back and focus on what is only speaking very softly in the world and inside you, then you can get your eyes on what actually matters, and then build pieces of technology based on that thing that actually matters, even though like it looks like the world is burning today. Oh, now it looks like this is happening today. Oh, now it looks like that's happening today.
Yeah. Sound and fury. Yeah, it's well, I think when you go deep into anything, whether it's your breath or it's music or it's a problem you're trying to solve or it's technology, you end up bumping into things that are very objectively true by necessity almost. Like you get down and you dig through and you brush away and you dig through the topsoil and you encounter some kind of bedrock. And that is it gives you a real feeling of stability when you know that there is problems that are stable and workable because they're not they're kind of the underpinnings of everything, and they're not, it takes you out of that spectator mindset and more of into kind of like a scout mindset where you're trying to figure out what is actually objectively true rather than trying to understand like what is kind of, it's like less of an interpreting a performance and more of kind of digging around through a pile of interesting objects. there's another like Peter Thielism that's like talking about when you have an idea for a startup, a lot of times that takes the form of knowing a secret that nobody else knows, and kind of like knowing that everybody else is wrong and you're right, and the kind of like weird little giddy feeling that comes with that is really something.
Yeah, and it's quite familiar with that feeling.
Yeah, that was the feeling. I mean, that was the feeling I used to have in back in the early days of cryptocurrency.
Sure. Yeah.
When like the word blockchain wasn't a thing that people knew about, and like anytime somebody like the news would like some like newspaper would like mention it in passing or something, people would like freak out on Reddit that like, hey, it got mentioned.
Yeah.
And like that was back in like 2014 or something. And I just remember going like, it's so weird to like be. And at the time, there was always this big part of me. There was like this. That I had this feeling, but it was very provisional because it was tempered by my own. It was tempered by the kind of like, doubts about whether I was completely delusional, and I just thought this was really important. It turns out it was, and I was right, and I shouldn't have doubted myself. But at the time, I was relatively young and much more doubting of myself about my relative assessment of how much I knew compared to the rest of the world about this specific thing. And so I learned my lesson, and I won't repeat that mistake. I'm endeavoring to pay a lot of attention, pay the proper respect to this when I encounter that kind of magical feeling of knowing a secret about things, and just having like this, like, there's a certain flavor to it. There's a certain flavor to this kind of conviction that you know something to be true that everybody else doesn't know yet.
It's a kind of, in my experience of it, it's a kind of fulfillment, a kind of like, it's not happiness, it's this like shining core of plasma from which happiness comes from, and you have it, and it doesn't need to be perceived by anyone else in that moment except you.
Yeah.
That's man's birthright, is to create that experience for himself. And if you have free will and a conscious reasoning mind, then that like unique snowflake cliche, you have something to bring into the world that no one else has a finger on.
Yeah.
The most immediate evidence for it is that you're seated behind those eyes. There's a spark of God interested in this little path. So potentially, like, novelty can come out of that.
Yeah.
If you lean into really where you are and what your tools are and what your desires are.
Yeah, it's like it's like following a tunnel deep through the thicket of something, and you think you're all alone, and then you break into a clearing and there's a bunch of people who also found their way there independently, and it's like, hey, that's maybe that's something to do with that we were talking about in the very beginning, about that people having weird connections, that they found each other in that clearing at some point. They were like passing around the torch underneath everything for a while. And the torch changes through time, but it's the same basic, like, think of like hundreds of years ago. It must have been pretty fucking crazy to be in like living in like Europe in like the 1500s, and there's like a bunch of scientists who all know each other, who were like writing each other letters about discovering like fucking shit in the sky that nobody, or like when they're just breaking into things that are just like, holy shit, what the fuck is this? The king doesn't know what the hell this is. The Pope doesn't know what this is. The local people sure as hell don't know what this is. I don't even know what this is, but at least I know that I don't know, and I'm just going to keep this secret and only try to talk about it with people that are not going to like burn me at the stake or ignore me. I don't know what would be worse.
My trick at the moment is there's like updates to my conscious assumptions of the world that I'm trying to articulate, and I've mentioned this before, I'm starting to see the stability of my lifestyle show proofs. And so now I have to like, okay, there are certain things that were just speculation about the reasons that I was living this way that now have bore objective fruits. So now there's certain like attitudes of how I do things that can't be done with an attitude of speculation anymore. They need to be upgraded into a conscious confidence now. Most obviously because I stayed healthy for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And for like 6 months before the pandemic started. Like that's probably the last time I fell sick.
Wait, did you ever get COVID?
No.
Interesting.
Not sick in the slightest this entire time, except emotionally, spiritually.
You got emotional COVID.
Which is a different way of saying that
Right.
I dealt with the wave of hardship that we were all dealing with in my own ball court.
Right. Fascinating.
And
That's really crazy that you never got COVID. That you never...
And I never stopped exposing myself to the greater world either.
That's fascinating.
And I never changed my basic strategy of how I navigate this exact fucking moment, which is a lot like a fucking guy with a blindfold following a Fantasia Cherubs flute song.
That's what the CDC recommended now, by the way.
As long as it's the right cherub, a government-sponsored cherub with a properly fact-checked flute song.
I heard the flute song received emergency use authorization. Yeah.
So I can objectively say things like, I'm one of the only humans in the entire world that was healthy for this window of history. So I'm doing something that's of objective value to human beings that other people aren't doing, because everyone else caught sick one way or the other.
Right.
And I didn't. So there is a certain amount of questioning that is now just ready to be like put down, or at least like I can go to the next phase of putting in more energy into this path than I had the bravery to do before.
Yeah.
But I can't get away from a relativistic worldview on all this. Like just the very word objective truth is like I'm engaged in this challenge of really taking seriously the idea that you can only perceive your own constructions, which is intensely postmodern and relativistic. But it's there's something about in that is something about how truth is created. You create it and you discover it at the same time. And so I created that fact of I was physically healthy for this time of history, and in the context, it's like a more radical statement, but like I created that truth, or I created that fact. So like other facts have been created by my life in relation to that.
Yeah. So the problem with postmodernism, though, is that it gave up on individualism, not that it's relativistic. I think that that's the seed of truth in postmodernism, is that truth is constructed in some sense. Reality is constructed in some sense. But postmodernism centers that on the society, and it basically says that society constructs reality, which is not true. It's really individuals who construct reality. But that's a position that postmodernism has kind of retreated from. I guess that's what makes it post, really, is that if modernism was the idea that you could do whatever you wanted, postmodernism is like a shrinking away from that a little bit. I think postmodernism is almost like, it's like a flinch. It's a flinch at the violence of modernism in some ways. It's like a kind of retreat. It's a temporary suspension of, it's a temporary voluntary suspension of agency, where you go, all this shit that modernism really fucked things up. We fucked things up, so we're gonna just step aside and say that whatever happens is because of everything, and then you get into the word salad stuff at that point.
It seems like such a huge jump in rationality to me to look at, on the part of all young people, to look at this slice of history and go, oh, we fucked things up so bad.
I know.
Like, oh, the planet is so fucked. Oh, we're so fucked.
I know.
Like, because I'm making this much a year, and adults at this time of my life and their slice of their history made that much per year, like, everything's set against me.
It is pretty crazy.
Really? Like, how long have you been alive? Like, how many objectively true things have you experienced so far? Like, maybe like 3 or 4 true things I've found so far. Like, again, I'm still collecting data, I think it tips the scales of your perception way too much to come to conclusions now about how fucked we've made things. Like, really? Like, let's just wait on the judgments and see how things play out.
I wonder if what's keeping this postmodern train going is, it's like people's belief that other people expect them to kind of like be willing to find solidarity in this kind of pretend dystopia that everyone kind of like uses as like a fashion item, a little sticker they can stick onto their public social persona about, like, how like, maybe almost like it's like kind of like, it's like a lazy way of signaling that you're self-aware or something. Like, if you say something like, oh, we're so fucked, you know what I mean? Aren't you really saying like, oh, don't worry, I'm self-aware. I'm like aware. I'm not like, you know what it is? Maybe it's like a backlash against, it's like this kind of adolescent attempt to disentangle yourself from the rugged individualism of the boomers or something. And maybe it's like a teenage type response or something like that. Because there's, I think, something similar happened in the Soviet Union that I've read about. There might be a parallel between this. Like, in the Soviet Union, apparently the propaganda about Soviet society was so kind of like basic. Like, where there'd be like a truck that would like drive through and like announce how victorious everything was, and like how everyone had bread, and like there was a chicken in every pot, you know, and like this kind of like very like materialistic, just like very base level, like things are great. And then like this, it kind of like bred this like deep cynicism in Russian society about like how like, oh, like you're one of those people, like so like there was this position, this social positioning where you find solidarity, or you try to like signal a kind of authenticity by going against what you perceive as like the forced narrative. And so maybe decades and decades and decades of American exceptionalism propaganda, which, I mean, the two things are both true. I do think America is an exceptionally fucking weird, amazing country, fucked up, amazing country. But there's also a lot of propaganda, and there's a huge ego about that too. Same with Germany, same with France, same with Japan, same with, I don't know, other places in the world that I'm not aware of probably, but certain places have like a pretty strong superego. And yeah, we have a very strong superego related to the idea that that like individualism is good. And so postmodernism is kind of like almost like, I think it's like an academically derived elitism signaling language or something that has just taken root, and because of the fact that it's in institutions, it gets like a lot of outsized airtime about the way things are, and you end up with word salad. Word salad is like the observed kind of like product of a mindset where you're obligated to talk about how just intractable and hopeless and beyond comprehension reality is. And so step aside and just let this insane, you know, I don't have any good examples at the ready, but I'm sure if you just crack open any like sociology book written in the last 10 years, you can probably just find like a few gems about how impossible our situation as a society is. And we should actually probably start digging our graves now.
Yeah, which is a different version of priests before the printing press saying like, there's no way you could ever understand this text.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
You need me to tell you what's in this text, and you need this text to live. It's like hopelessly over your head, but don't worry, I'm here.
Yeah. Well, it's also, people have almost, I feel like there's a kind of conditioning where people expect language now to be almost like the tone and the formatting and the completeness is more important than what it's actually saying. Like, it's a very authoritarian use of language when you see like I was looking at like the COVID test kit or something, instructions, and instead of just saying like, because someone who lives at my house ordered one, and we were like, I was like looking at like the instruction booklet of it, and it was like this really, really stilted language describing how every single step of it, almost like I was reading like it was just like riddled with all these legal disclaimers, and it had like these icons that were like, the graphic design was like violent somehow. I don't know how to say it, but it was like almost like the needle was like, and then like there was like a little hand that was like, stop, and then like go to the next step, and like warning, and then go to the next step, and like it was like you were being like, you were like a cow, and you were just being like herded through this process. And the funny thing was, at the very end of it, it said like, if you have negative results, it does not mean that you don't have COVID. You can still have COVID, and you should still isolate. I'm like, what is the fucking point of this test then? You know? So, you know what I mean? So like it's almost like and that's an example of just, cover your ass language, obviously. But I think that it's like this, the aesthetics of like the aesthetics of institutional communication is a very pervasive influence on generally the kind of stuff you read on the internet. Like Google now, most things on Google, if you type Google some random thing, you're gonna get like there's like the same 200 websites that always pop up. There isn't a richness of results anymore. It's like authoritative sources. Oh, so you mean gobbledygook? Because gobbledygook is another word for authoritative language. It's something that isn't saying anything, but it's like you've been assigned an essay in your school and you're really just trying to get an A, and so you want to follow the syllabus perfectly and like, yeah, and it's almost just like there's a kind of exhaustion that arises in me when I read that kind of thing. So I talk about meditation. I try to get some distance from that and look at documents like that as an artifact of characteristic of a kind of time and context that we're living in.
Well, I had an impulse to more closely examine that idea that I texted you, that politics is downstream from culture. And it was such a intuitive thing. Like, I only just like perceived the shadows of like implications in that.
Yeah.
When I texted you that we should talk about that.
Yeah.
I can at least say at the moment that, well, culture is downstream from the individual. But politics being downstream from culture, what does that mean?
Well, culture being downstream from the individual is a very anti-postmodernist idea. That directly relates to what we were just talking about. That is not a commonly held assumption. Postmodernism is almost like the inversion of that idea, that the individual is downstream from culture and that culture arises through inscrutably complex means independent of what people do.
Well, if it wasn't downstream from culture or from individuals, then it wouldn't like be dependent on individuals, and then you would have human culture possible without any humans there.
So maybe herein lies postmodernism's hostility to the idea of great individuals, is because great individuals are perhaps the most glaring counterexample to the supposition that culture is not downstream from individuals.
I think there's a lot of resentment because so much is downstream from the powerful individuals.
Yeah.
That like a given activist is working their ass off to like canvass or like push through this piece of legislation that they slaved over in this like one local part of their country, and they have to jump through hoops of bureaucracy. And then meanwhile, Elon Musk just like shrugs and pushes a button and enacts way more change.
Or what was that? I mean, or who was the guy who invented nu metal that you talked?
Ross Robinson.
Yeah, Ross Robinson. Like, when you like, you know, as a person who's like a metal musician, can sit here and tell that story, and everyone just goes like, yeah, sure. Oh yeah, wow, what an amazing guy. You know, he created a whole genre. But like, that is somehow, because it's art, that narrative is, people accept that. But if you try to say like, you know, if you tried to apply that attitude and point out that there is really important people in the world in contexts that are more explicitly political, then you're going to find a lot more resistance to that idea, because it's like, seems to be going against the idea that it's almost like, it's like calling people out for believing that they can't do anything with their life.
Yeah.
Which is uncomfortable.
And if you accept that you can't do much with your life, then you're going to experience a lot of resentment and anger towards people who are doing things with their life.
Okay, isn't it just really strange that one of the side effects of living in a world where we have such potential given to us on a silver platter is that we have to sit here and like deconstruct the argument of why we can do that. Like, isn't that strange? Like, you know what I mean? Like in like what is, I don't know. I just think there's some real like, just like prima facie, just kind of like a real incongruency between us feeling like we have all this ability to affect the world and reach people from with the internet and learn anything we want to and find people who are doing similar things, like more so than ever before. We're not dying in a war. We have bountiful food. We have infinite information. We have all this stuff. We're like, we have the potential to be more self-aware than any generation in the history of humankind because of the context that we're living in. And yet our primary antagonism, what you and I are sitting here talking about right now, is we're like deconstructing this attitude that you're liable to just soak up accidentally living in a world where you have all this ability. Like the biggest threat is just your own belief that you don't, like your unwillingness to accept it or something like that. It's such a strange situation.
Well, it's
like postmodernism. What a weird creature in the historical landscape.
There's bigger things than that acting to disempower you. If you think climate catastrophe is a thing and mass dieback of humanity is imminent, then that's gonna put to bed most of your personal desires, and you'll put them to bed yourself. You believe the world's ending, and so it's not about what you want anymore. It's about what has to happen now.
So I guess what
is there's a lot of narratives happening like that that present themselves with facts and apparent authority figures backing up the facts. Like, it can be very incontrovertible. Like, so you're gonna die, and your children are gonna die.
But why do people want to put to bed their aspirations for life? Why do people want that?
I don't know. It's certainly really hard. My life is really hard, and my life is based on grasping all the opportunities that are in front of me and really going in the direction of my desires as much as possible.
Yeah, and it hasn't been easy for you.
And no, it's very hard. Maybe. So yeah, maybe it's just easier to go with other things than what you most truly want to be doing. But I don't know. I think that'd be even harder for me. I don't think I would have survived to this point.
Yeah.
If I wasn't going in the direction of my desires. But you are right that I don't even know if it's a goal of liberalism anymore, but I thought it was to have equality of opportunity. And if that's the goal, we've definitely been winning.
Yeah.
Increasingly every year. There's much more equality of opportunity.
There's more equality of opportunity now than there ever has been in the history of the human race.
Yeah. And that hasn't, if that's made things easier for me, I haven't noticed. But I'm using all of the opportunity I can get. And it seems like there's a lot of vital things to do, as long as you aren't just running around screaming that the sky is falling.
If you lived in a different time where you had much less opportunity, I think the way you feel is more a function of your personality than... the way you specifically feel is more a function of your personality than the circumstances that you're in. Because I would imagine that, if you lived in the year 1500, you'd probably be sitting there, like, agonizing over creating a work of art out of, like, like paint and canvas or something.
Uh-huh.
And if someone when they came and talked to you, you tell them an analogous narrative of how this is so important, and it would be, because it's like I think it's just to the extent to which you grasp the extent to which you grasp what's in front of you is like, I think more of a function of just the kind of person you are. But it's just that, I don't know, maybe what's different now is that life has enough free time to construct a whole justification, like a public mainstream justification for why we don't do things and we shouldn't and it's pointless. Whereas like maybe, back in the times before before mass media, the only people who really got to set narratives were people who did things. But now there's a kind of collectivization of mainstream thought in a way that like there's now a seat at the table for the person who doesn't do anything, and is kind of like holding that up as an ideal of kind of like, accepting this idea that life is like just a sort of a vapor, like a vapid, just try to enjoy it. And there's no more spirituality in the world, and there's no more goals, there's no more, like, the idea of progress of the human race is not something that exists. So just try to be nice and politely walk into oblivion, and minimize your carbon footprint. And that's like the goal of life. Like that, what a strange historical point to be at, where we have like the luxury of that perspective, but also haven't moved through that perspective yet. It's a strange bridge.
Yeah, well, maybe this free time has just showed up problems of the psyche not yet encountered.
Yeah.
You free up this much free time, and you have this many calories in your system, and this much psychological assurance that you're not going to get murdered anytime soon.
Yeah.
You have space to think. You have like orders of magnitude more space to think than ever before in history. And so that shows up issues of humanity that were always waiting for us once we got to this point.
Yeah.
And it's like a big boss battle.
Oh my God, this just connected. This is what postmodernism is it's fixating on the feeling of suffering you get when you are making progress. It's the societal version of that. Literally.
Yeah.
It's like mistaking the aesthetics and the fashion of self-awareness with actual self-awareness. It's a kind of like, obviously this is obviously buried in my psyche too. I'm trying to overcome this myself.
Yeah, me too. And I've had an experience like what you just said, where there's a brand new kind of existential weight on my psyche here at this point, where I'm moving faster than I've ever moved before.
Yeah.
And so I'm experiencing a more like concrete imprisonment of certain parts of my psyche than I've ever experienced before.
Yeah.
But like, I couldn't have got to those. The only reason I was able to see those weak points of my psyche is by virtue of like being higher functioning, and more productive, more creative than I've ever been. And yes, you're right. Postmodernism is like taking that eventuality of facing bigger and bigger hardships and then going, see, so you should never do anything.
Yeah, and when I come in contact with the postmodern part of myself that's latent within myself, that's what stimulates me to rant against postmodernism. And truthfully, like, I wouldn't care about this if it wasn't something that I was affected by. There's plenty of terrible things that I don't care and don't think about because they don't affect me. And thank God, because you would never survive if you had to deal with every problem in the world at once. I really hope that people have as least problems as possible. It's just humanly possible. But yeah, there's definitely a clue about what's blocking you in the things that you feel like if you look at the universal, if you look at the world as the projector screen that you're projecting your own personal movie onto, it's like, what does that say about, I mean, I guess it's just because maybe you and I both are trying to do something different, that stagnancy of the world itself is like this metaphor for stagnancy of ourselves, or the potential threat of it. And so you want to rail against it, and you want to deconstruct it, and you want to come up with rational underpinnings for why you're doing the right thing. But I don't know. I think the truth is, I was telling this to Alicia the other day, that like, at least like with Satellite, I frequently tell myself and dress up my motivation with all of these logical underpinnings about why it's good and all this stuff, and why it's important and blah blah blah. But the truth is, I just love it. I just like working on it, and I love the soul of it.
Yeah.
And that's all there is. And that's really, truthfully, it's just love.
Yeah.
And then I have to explain why I do it, but it's an explanation, it's a rationalization. And yeah, maybe postmodernism, I'm just rationalizing why I don't like it. It just feels icky to me, the idea of giving up. And so I want to deconstruct academic theories about why giving up is good. I feel maybe you don't really need to, though. Maybe just walk away, or walk towards whatever it is that you love, and just don't really worry about defending it.
Yeah, it seems like in the arc of history that I'm aware of, it seems like a universal constant that there's people who have given up and are giving up and trying to convince everyone in the world that it's pointless.
Yeah.
That's a constant. They're always going to be there. And there's always going to be a minority of people who see that, grant the facts that support that, and then go back to their own world that's proof against that.
Yeah.